And just so everyone is aware, we are now going live on YouTube. So there'll be a 20-second delay, but we are in process.
Thank you all for being here. We're at the start. So Lawrence, should I go forth and?
Yes, please.
Good.
I don't think
Okay.
that Selena needs any introduction. There's quite a bit going on in the world, and we're so thankful for you to be able to spend time and share your wisdom and experience with us. So I'm going to let you do your own introduction, and I'm going to quiet myself.
Well, thank you, Lawrence, and for all the people on the Puget Sound Pagan Pride team for making it possible for this event to happen. Thanks to all of you who are taking part in the Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook, and I celebrate our connections. I'd like to start my Ancestral Pathways workshop with a chant. If you wish, with yourself muted, so that we aren't all out of sync, but I invite you to join in this very simple ancestor honoring chant. And as I do the chant, I invite you to connect with the sacred according to your own path and to attune to the ancestral realm according to that path. Ancestors, we call to you. Ancestors, we honor you. Ancestors, we call to you. Ancestors, we honor you. Ancestors, we call to you. Ancestors, ancestors, we honor you. All hail to the ancestors. I honor you with offerings and a hyssop. I honor you with offerings of sacred fire. I honor you with sacred air. I honor you with sacred spirit. Come be with us, guide us, aid us in understanding the ways of ancestors as a whole, and help us deepen our ways of working with particular ancestors as part of our journey together. My name's Selena Fox, and I'm coming to you live from my study in my home in Wisconsin, USA. I began my work with ancestors early on in life. In fact, my first understandings of ancestors came as a result of ancestors appearing to me in dreams. I didn't know at the time, I was a young girl, that they were ancestral dreams. As an adult now, looking back into that time, clearly it was a time in which I was beginning a lifelong journey with the ancestral realm. As a result of having dreams, I talked with family members, in particular, my grandparents. And indeed, one of my grandparents, when I talked to her about this place that I had seen in Scotland, said, well, I think that's an old family home. And indeed, about 25 years ago or so, I made a journey to Scotland and actually connected with a very distant relative and got even a picture. This is the home from the 1700s as a result of that visit. Most of my ancestral connections, though, have come in some very different ways through research, through talking with family members and gathering stories, through pilgrimages to places connected with ancestors. What I'd like to share with you today are several forms of ancestral pathways. I'd like to begin by talking about 3 different ancestral pathways connected with honoring ancestors of 3 different types. Many people, when they hear ancestor, specifically think of ancestors of family. And indeed, many people who work with ancestors as part of spiritual practice, that is the way or a primary way for that to happen. When I talk about the path of ancestors of family, I not only include ancestors that we descend biologically from, but ancestors of lines that we are attuned to. I am a real mixed ancestrally, ethnically, racially. I celebrate all of that diversity. Yes, I'm an American mutt, you might say, or a multicolored tapestry. And as I have continued to learn about different family lines, I've come to understand a deeper understanding of how family ancestry works. Part of my Scottish ancestry has led me to understand that several hundred years ago, and even more recently, Scottish families were organized in clans, especially in the Highland areas. In lowland Scotland, sometimes they were called houses or households. The families that were part of the Scottish clan had not only people that were descended biologically along family lines, but other people who were aligned with that particular family grouping. I see those in my life who I've connected with over family ancestors, including I have a niece who is adopted into the family line of one of my sisters. I consider her part of our family. And while she may not be biologically descended from the ancestors, she is part of that ancestral family tradition. So if you are adopted, either legally or energetically, into a family, then as you work with family ancestors, you can take your journey back through time with those particular family lines that are part of that family system. The second form of ancestral pathway is the ancestors of place. Ancestors, a place where you live. And connected with place where you live, ancestors that are connected with the governmental unit that part is connected with the culture that's connected with that place. I live in southwestern Wisconsin, and I originally grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so I'm a transplant. One of the things that I've come to do through my connections here near the little village of Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, is resonate with the Scandinavian people who helped settle that particular area and connect with my own family ancestors who also had Scandinavian roots. But also nearby where I live is a state park called Blue Mound State Park. And before it became a state park, long ago, before European contact with this area, that was a sacred place of the Ho-Chunk people. I'm not descended from the Ho-Chunk, but I have had an ongoing connection with Ho-Chunk people. There are people within the Circle Sanctuary community. It's the name of the organization and community that I helped birth many, many years ago. And I've had connections with ancestral place, sacred sites with the Ho-Chunk. Indeed, a number of years ago, there was an effort on the part of some people in the Wisconsin legislature to try to take away the protections of Native American burial sites, sacred mounds across the area. And I joined, along with a lot of other people, with the various tribes, not only the Ho-Chunk, but all 11 tribes that are part of Wisconsin, to stand up to keep those sacred places protected. So while I am not Ho-Chunk, part of my ancestral journey with place has been to be an ally and to help protect the heritage and to support the peoples that continue to be part of this area, this society. The third form of ancestral pathway has to do with the ancestors of spiritual tradition. I have been pagan since I was a young girl, although I didn't call it pagan back then. when I became a teenager and started my journey into the adult world, I came to understand and claim the word. First it was pantheist, and then I claimed the word pagan for myself. And I honor not only pagans that I know who have died and gone into the ancestral realm, but I honor, especially at Samhain time, late October here in the Northern Hemisphere, early November, I honor those who have been part of paganism in the ancient past, as well as with the revival, the rebirth of paganism beginning in the mid 20th century. I also put into the mix some of those people whose thoughts about honoring the sacred in nature. I kind of weave that into my pagans of spiritual tradition, ancestor practice. John Muir may not have called himself a pagan, but he clearly was someone who revered the wild and did a lot to protect it. Emerson is another person who helped birth some awareness about the importance of eco-spirituality. What I'd like to share with you now is some practices for working with each of these pathways. I think one of the easiest pathway practices is to have an ancestral altar. I actually have several ancestral altars. I have put together a sample ancestral altar here to give you an idea of some things that you might find helpful to include on an ancestral altar if you don't already have one. I like to have some kind of what I call portal device, and I typically use a clear quartz crystal. That serves as a focal point for my honoring of ancestors, and when I do work, especially at the times when somebody has crossed over into the other world. And at Samhain time, it is an opportunity to activate the altar and the working. And then when I conclude it, then I have a mechanism, a key to that work that I also can work with. Having photographs can be a wonderful way for connecting with ancestors. But if you have ancestors that were from a time before there was photography, well, you might create your own sketch, or if they did some work and you delve into the genealogical work, actually through about 20 some years ago, as I was researching one of my ancestral lines, through the internet, I connected with a very, very distant cousin who actually had a photograph of an illustration of an ancestor that I had that dates way back to the 1700s. So that's how I came to get this. If you don't have photographs or illustrations, you can write the name or names of ancestors on cards and put them on your altar. And you might also look for artifacts. I grew up in Virginia, I was born in Virginia. So to honor my Virginia ancestors, where a lot of my family still lives, I have a flag from Virginia. On both sides of my family, some of my ancestors from Europe came to America early on and were part of the process of birthing the USA in various ways. They were part of the American Revolution. So I actually got myself a flag from that time period of reproduction that I have as part of a larger ancestral altar that I have year round. I have ancestors from many different places. And a number of years ago, as part of my looking at understanding my connection with Switzerland and my German-speaking Swiss ancestors, I went to a local area in Wisconsin that was settled by a number of people with Swiss heritage. And of course, this is in a pre-pandemic time, and there was a lot of tourism back then. And I happened to go in one of the shops and found something from Switzerland and the actual canton that my ancestors came from. You might find it helpful to put some kind of item that you have gathered on an ancestral journey. Well, my Scottish ancestry line on my father's side, the oak is an important symbol, and the acorn comes from this land, but it connects me with that ancestral realm. You might find as you journey into ancestral ways, you might find some symbol, some image connected with either spiritual tradition, ancestors of place in society, or your family ancestors. And you may want to put that on your altar as well. A number of years ago, I put forth a sketch of one of my Scottish lines, one of the family lines, and a friend of mine who is part of the Circle Sanctuary community actually crafted it in ceramic for me. This actually, I first saw the image on a framed piece that was passed down several generations on my father's side. And it's an old Scottish family known as Bissett, and it has an image of a cut off oak tree sprouting green again. Well, I not only have used this as an ancestor symbol for connecting with family, because I have lines that worked with this symbol for many, many years, but I've actually adopted that symbol as part of my own spiritual practice and see it as a metaphor for contemporary paganism. Paganism flourished for thousands of years, and then there was about 1,600 years of bad PR. I'm not trying to be facetious, but it was a challenging time. And now paganism is rebirthing again. So essentially, it's sprouting, it's growing green again. The motto is reveriscit, it grows green again and again and again. So for me, that is a powerful message, not only coming from my own family ancestral work, but it's something that has helped me work with helping with so many others to bring back paganism into the light, into the public view. Never again the burning times, as we say. You might have things that have been passed down to you through family lines or spiritual tradition lines. I have a little cameo that got passed to me by my grandmother, and she gave this to me while she was alive. This is my father's mother, and it's been on my ancestral altar ever since. So there may be things that you have that you hadn't even thought about them possibly being on an altar, a letter that you have received from a family member that's no longer alive, somebody's signature, all photographs of homes, of places. All of these are items you can put on your ancestral altar. Some people like to have a particular altar just for their family ancestors, and then a more general altar for all the other types of ancestors. Others will have a universalist type of ancestor altar and have symbols from each of those three types. Another way of working with an ancestor altar can be at the time where somebody is crossing over into that ancestral realm, in which case you will have an altar specifically to aid that person as they complete their incarnation and go into the realm of the ancestors. So that can be very specific. I know that some people find it helpful at Samhain time to create a special altar for connecting with ancestors that are used as part of that celebration. Samhain is, in many traditions, a new year, but it's also connected with honoring the dead. And beloved dead, those you've known who've crossed over, and ancestral dead going even back further in time. I like to use the word ancestor in a more universal way, so it includes the beloved dead as well, but different traditions will vary according to that. For ancestral altars at Samhain, at our Circle Sanctuary community in past years, what we have done when we've been able to gather in person is turn our entire temple room on the main day of our 3-day festival into an ancestral temple. We have many, many tables along all the walls. They're draped with black cloths, and atop them, the various community members have opportunities to have one or more ancestral photographs, pictures, artifacts there. And we have everyone bring a candle as a way of having that be a focal point for the individual altars that are part of our massive community altars. We also have an altar that we set up that has pictures of people in our community and within paganism as a whole that have crossed over in the past year. So we have the recent dead altar, and there we honor those beloved dead. This is their first Samhain being in the other world. What are things else that you put on an altar? Offerings of some kind. For some people, it may be a stick of incense, or such as I have here, flowers that I picked. Flowers are wonderful. You've got the earth, the greenery, and the water. So you've got two elemental energies, as well as the spirit of the plants. Some people like to write letters to one or more ancestors at Samhain time in particular, and place that on an altar. It may be a request. And then there's artwork that people have created, poetry and other expressions that are tributes to the ancestors or may be specific to a particular ancestor. So another way of being able to connect with ancestors as part of your practices is to do ancestral research. I started doing ancestral research, as I mentioned early on, when I started talking to relatives as I had these dreams. And then as I got older, I started to write down stories, collect stories, and then I got really serious about ancestral research, in particular on my family ancestral pathway, and started visiting cemeteries and courthouses, record archives. I traveled about 25 years ago across the great water called the Atlantic and did some research at the National Archives in Scotland, as well as visited a variety of ancestral places. One of the great things about so many records, genealogical records being digitized, they're now getting more available online. And while this pandemic has certainly been a challenging time, it continues to be, a positive thing that we can do during this time where we're online so much is actually see this as an opportunity as part of one's online explorations to start looking for information about ancestors. You can Google a name connected with you if you know that. You can find out about some pagan leaders who have crossed over by learning about them. If you don't know much about the layers of culture in the particular place where you are living, you can do some research that way. So all three pathways of ancestors of family and ancestors of place and ancestors of spiritual tradition lend themselves to doing some research. What I'd like to do now is just share a few things, pointers, specifically about family ancestral research, but it also can be applied to the other paths as well. What you'd like to do when you're looking at a particular ancestor is not only get their name, but be aware that the name might be spelled in more than one way, depending on what century and where the records were being kept. As people came to the USA, sometimes the records got changed as a result of whoever was noting down the names, doing the immigration records. They might not have had the best spelling skills. And sometimes people had handwriting that also was subject to interpretation. Some people, when they came to America in the 1700s and the 1800s, to a certain extent, those centuries, but it even continued on into the early part of the 20th century, some people chose to alter the family name. And that's a whole nother workshop about sorting that out. However, in addition to having the name of the ancestor that you have learned through family sources, it's also important to be aware that there might be variant spellings. Take a look at the surname. If you have a surname in your family, what does the surname mean? Where did that originate? That's really good for internet research, but don't rely on just one source. And in any genealogical research that you do online, it's important not only to make good notes of what you are discovering, but note your sources and vet your sources. Just because it's online doesn't mean it's true. I think we all have come to know that. And it's really important that you track your sources and link it to the information. As you move from that kind of research and connect with one or more of the genealogical databases that are online, where there is sharing of information, then you are able to share your sources as part of that. And you also can have some clues of how to sort things out when there are discrepancies. Get the basic facts for an ancestor. Where were they born? What day was they born? What was the year? Also, find out, if you can, who the parents were, who siblings were. Find out about life passages for an ancestor, where they were married, the date, and the spousal names and lines that go back. Find out about, if you can, education, career journeys, places where they've lived. Look for wills, the home location, lots of other recorded information. A really powerful way of getting ancestral information from ancestors of family is to talk to living relatives, and to do it sooner rather than later. It is really powerful to be able to hear stories passed on, and if you can, video them. If video recordings aren't an option, try to at least get an audio recording, or if that's not an option, take really copious notes and check with the person to make sure you have the information correct. Not all oral stories are 100% accurate. The oral tradition, which has been a way of sharing lore and history across cultures through the ages, can really be a wealth of information, but it also can get fabricated and distorted. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Look for articles and books, and I think a really important thing as one researches ancestors and family is to take a look at what ethnic roots, what other things were connected with the ancestor, and not just limit your explorations to the particular ancestor. I knew that I was descended from some German-speaking Swiss on my mother's side, and I started researching that whole pattern of coming from Europe and coming to America back in the 1700s. And as a result of some of that research, I came to learn a lot about European history that led to my ancestors coming to this country. And eventually, I encountered an actual genealogical chart in a book from a very distant cousin who happened to be a university professor that spoke German as well as English, and went to Switzerland and recorded in English church records. Well, that was a really wonderful discovery. And that for me wasn't the only thing that I did with that. I actually went to the community where my ancestors lived back in the early 1700s. And some of the buildings are now historic buildings, and I was able to go there and learn more about it. It was actually a Christian mystical community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And certainly there were things that I learned about strength and persistence, which I can draw on, but some of their practices, like only sleeping a few hours at a time and only eating a meal a day and sleeping on a wooden pillow, I'm not going there in terms of resonating with that kind of ancestral practice that was part of that spiritual community that they were part of. I think artifacts can be really a fascinating way of linking in with ancestors of different types. If you are able to connect with places, and if it is permitted to do so, you may want to get a pebble or a bit of dirt from a particular area and be able to put it on your altar to link you to an ancestral place. Indeed, when I went to Scotland back in 96 and 97, I got permission to go to one of these old caves that was on old family land, and was able to get some things from that, which allows me to connect not only with the place, but the place through time. Graveyards. Can't really do an Ancestral Pathways workshop without talking about honoring the dead. And what kind of information you can get by going to a graveyard. Certainly you can photograph tombstones, and if the cemetery is okay with it, you can take a pebble or a bit of dirt from an ancestral grave. But I think even more important than those approaches is to tend the grave, if that's permitted. With most cemeteries do allow people to do work around the graves of their loved ones. My Fox family line goes back to the Shenandoah River Valley of Virginia. And indeed, in the 1930s, my Fox family ancestors were among 100 families that were displaced to make the Shenandoah National Park a thing. So they had to relocate. I actually have an ancestral cemetery on federal land and have been able to go and visit it. And each time I've visited it, I've taken a little broom and some paper toweling to care for the gravestones that are there. I do think that in addition to these ways of getting information about ancestors, these are opportunities to also resonate with particular ancestors. Spiritual relationships are really important as part of spiritual life. And ancestors, to me, are an important part of spiritual life. Developing a relationship with specific ancestors as well as groupings of ancestors. Have an altar or have an ancestral symbol on your main home altar that you work with. Do ancestral alignment rituals. Do honoring of your ancestors at Samhain time, if your particular spiritual path involves celebrating the Sabbats. Doing honoring of your ancestors at other times. Some people take Memorial Day in the USA as a time not only to pay respects to those who have died in service, military service to the USA, but it's actually evolved to be a time for tending graves. It used to be called Decoration Day back in the mid 1800s when it started emerging as a thing. And so in Wisconsin, I've come to learn, my husband's multiple lines of his family came to Wisconsin back in the mid 1800s. So there are lots of ancestral cemeteries connected with his side of the family. And there, the custom has been on Memorial Day, you go out and you go to all the graves of your relatives and take care of them, put flowers there, whether they had military service or not. Another thing to pay attention to, rites of passage. Certainly, funerals are a time where we think about the ancestral realm as a loved one has crossed over to the ancestral realm. But one of the things that I've done over the years, as I've done baby blessings and weddings, coming of age into young adulthood, coming of age into seniorhood, and other type of life passage rites, with those whose rite I'm facilitating's permission, we weave in a calling of the ancestors to bless that life passage. So that's another approach to working with ancestors. And then I think doing some divination with ancestral realms can be a really powerful way of growing your connection and your understanding. It can take the form of dream incubation, going to sleep, putting forth a particular message and request, or it can take the form of celebrating the ancestors as you do a reading, calling for them through cards, oracle cards, tarot cards, through rune stones, some other form of divination, to call the ancestors to come and to be present and to speak with you in that way. One of the things I want to encourage everyone to do is to make some place in your life where you gather your ancestral information. If you have it online somewhere, I would also encourage you to put it in some kind of actual tangible form. And why am I saying that? Well, over time, the technology changes, and it can be really helpful to actually have a printout as backup. I created an ancestral book for one of my lines a number of years ago, and I not only printed out the various charts, but in here I have put some notes, and I do think the notebook approach can be a wonderful way of gathering your information together. In this last part of the workshop, I'm going to take a look at some things in the chat, and I'm going to answer some questions. And Ashley said, I've been trying to find a way to reach out to ancestors when I was raised with my culture erased. And I know I have some Native American ancestry, and what happened in Virginia in the 1920s, the racial designation was changed, and it's very hard to get that information. My ancestors did not go on the Trail of Tears. They hung out in the hills of the Appalachians and passed for white. And actually, this image I have of my great-grandmother is all that I've been able to get so far about her, along with family stories about her Native American roots. She's in 1800s white people's clothing, but kind of the clue as I look are her feathers in her ears. So she kept a bit of her culture. So what are some good ways to find out about your ancestors? If you have Native American ancestors, those particular tribes, or some other ones. An excellent resource is the Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And although the pandemic is happening and people aren't going into the museums as they once were, there are some really excellent online resources. And indeed, there are some networking publications for different tribal groups. One of the wonderful things that's been happening over the last few decades, number of people are setting down in records more information about lore and traditions. I also think that if you are able, Ashley, to go to a particular area with the right protocols that is sacred to one or both of those tribes, and to do an honoring there following whatever the protocols are for that land, that can be an opening for the ancestors in your own line to come forth and to point you in directions to learn more. And I'm looking at Cat Bees. I find it easier to connect with ancestors I personally met, but with Ancestry, I have more ancestors I'd like to add in. What's the best way to go about it with so little personal knowledge? Well, Ancestry.com, before it became Ancestry.com, took a lot of the information of freeware called RootsWeb, and I was very active with RootsWeb back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I know that there's a lot of really excellent information. So I do think it's important to look at resources, and as you're gathering information, to make your own notes. where you've gotten the information, and then as you've had some names come to you and other information, I'd invite you to consider doing a particular ritual to ask the particular ancestor you found to guide you to some additional information. I'm wondering if there's some, here's one more. Do you have some advice for working with problematic ancestors? Who doesn't have somebody in their family system, present or past, that could be construed as problematic? One of the things that I think is really powerful about having multiple ancestral pathways, the ancestors of family, the ancestors of place, and ancestors of spiritual tradition. If you're finding some difficulties with one of those pathways, one of those sectors, you can call on some ancestral support from a different pathway to guide you. But if you go back in your family line far enough, whether you know the names, whether there's any information about the person or not, go back far enough in your ancestral ways and ask for ancestors of healing to come forth and guide you in your ancestral work. And I see it says, the creepy uncle, the great grandparent who owned slaves, the pagan leader has fallen out of grace. Yes, this is a really good question. Do we have a responsibility to speak to this? I do think we need to be aware that just because we have a connection with somebody doesn't mean we buy in everything that they were about. And indeed, I do think we can work with ancestral forces in ways that can inform our work today to build a better society with more equality, liberty, and justice for everybody. And I do think that can be a powerful way to reclaim some of that ancestral energy as we move forward. You do not have to call forth, a problematic family ancestor that was engaged in activities you want nothing to do. I would go back further in the line and call on other ancestors to be with you as you journey in that kind of ancestral realm. And then another one, do you have any advice for people whose ancestors were victims of human trafficking, slavery, and therefore don't have ancestral records to research? Yes, one of the things that you can do, if you know their names, if you don't know their names, that's okay. I would do an ancestor honoring and calling ceremony and asked that the powers of the ancestral realm come to you to help you develop a relationship with those ancestors. I do think in terms of African American ancestors that were enslaved, that came to America, the Museum of African American History and Culture, also a Smithsonian museum. John Lewis was instrumental in helping to manifest that. He worked for years to have it, and one of his great gifts to America today was helping to manifest that. Oprah also was involved, and a whole lot of other people. That particular institution is pulling together information and is a great resource. There also is a really good resource in Baltimore, Maryland, for people that really want to connect with African American heritage. But not everybody who was enslaved was African American and came directly from Africa. There is clearly a whole lot going down in the Caribbean. And so there are some ways you can possibly get some information, at least about the people. I see we have a few minutes left. I know we're on several different platforms. I'm going to see from Lawrence if there's other questions that are appearing in other ways.
Nothing from YouTube at the moment, so I'll let you keep answering questions here, and we've got about 6-7 minutes left.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is to invite all of you to just take a few moments now and pick one of those 3 pathways of ancestors and focus on it as we honor ancestors. Imagine yourself being on that pathway, a pathway that is the ancestors of family, or the pathway of the ancestors of place, or the pathway of the ancestors of spiritual traditions. In the next few moments, I invite you to join with me and speak or sing this chant. Ancestors, we call to you. Ancestors, we call to you. Ancestors, we call to you. Bring us guidance. Spend a few moments experiencing yourself on that pathway. Imagine a light coming down that pathway, coming and being before you. Spend a few moments seeing that radiant light, and then a form appears. Pay attention to what form the ancestor takes, and invite that ancestor to bring you a word, a phrase, a symbol, a sensation in the next couple of moments. Knowing that you can work with this imagery and this meditation long after this workshop is over in your own way. Give thanks to what you have experienced. Give thanks to the ancestor. Give thanks to the ancestral realm. Ancestors, we honor you. Ancestors, we remember you. Ancestors, guide us. Ancestors, teach us. Ancestors, we thank you. Ancestors, we thank you. Ancestors, we thank you. We give thanks to the ancestors in whatever way or ways that they've been with us today. May they continue to work with us in a way that is right for them and for us. May we continue to grow in our awareness of our interconnection with each other and with that larger circle of humankind and that larger circle of nature of which we are all part. Ancestors, we honor you, we remember you, we thank you. And I see somebody put something in about voting. So I will bring up John Kinsey, and he was in the First Continental Congress. I will tell you, It's important for us to get that patriotic spirit, those of us in America, and register to vote, find out how to vote, find out about your choices, and indeed vote. It is good for our country, and it's good for the future, for us to be participants in the here and now. For after all, we are the ancestors of tomorrow, and what we do today creates the reality for people in the future, whether we have children or not. Thank you all so much for being here, and I really appreciate all of the questions and things. If you want to be in touch with me, you can find me on Instagram, Selena Fox, on YouTube. I got a channel. You can connect with me, Selena_Fox on Twitter, and on Facebook, Selena Fox Updates. And you can email me, selena@circlesanctuary.org. And we have lots of stuff out in cyberspace, and I'm so glad to be able to be with all of you. My first virtual pagan pride this year. Many thanks to Lawrence and the whole team for this fabulous opportunity. And it's time for yet another workshop. Many blessings.